How do you heal a city built on wounds, when all it takes is a single act of cruelty or a single act of kindness to tip the balance? On a rain-drenched night at a lonely LA diner, three unlikely guardians, a nurse with too many scars, a veteran haunted by the past, and his service dog Shadow, stood their ground against hate. What happened next would send shockwaves through a city, challenge everything we believe about loyalty, and prove that healing always starts with standing together. If stories of hope rising from hardship move you, please give this video a like. And if you want to follow true stories where love and loyalty fight back, hit subscribe and join our growing community. Tonight, discover how ordinary people and one extraordinary dog changed a city's heart. It was the kind of Los Angeles night that could make anyone feel small. Rain battered the cracked neon sign of Charlie's Diner, the letters flickering behind streaked glass. Inside, the world shrank to a few worn booths and the steady hiss of coffee brewing behind the counter. Every so often, thunder rattled the plates, and lightning illuminated the faces of the few souls who'd braved the storm. Mia Carter, still wearing the blue scrubs from a never-ending ER shift, sat hunched at the counter, elbows propped on a laminated menu she wasn't really reading. Her eyes were heavy, her mind still caught between the sharp hospital lights and the hush that comes only after saving a life, or watching one slip away. She absently traced a crack in the countertop, the adrenaline still humming in her veins, keeping her awake even as exhaustion pressed down on her. In the corner booth, Walter Briggs nursed a chipped mug of black coffee, his eyes shadowed under a battered baseball cap. Next to his work boots lay a puddle forming from his soaked jeans. But what most people noticed first wasn't Walter. It was Shadow, the German shepherd at his feet, sitting with the poised stillness of a soldier on duty. Shadow's ears flicked toward every sound: the clatter of cutlery, the whisper of rain, the distant rumble of the city that never truly slept. Mia had seen them before, a regular pairing on these sleepless nights. Walter, grizzled and quiet, always kept one hand near his dog's thick fur, as if grounding himself. Shadow was more than a pet. The way he watched Walter, you'd think he was guarding a piece of his own heart. The bell over the diner's door jingled, loud and harsh against the hush. Two men stumbled in, laughter echoing off the walls. They were soaked and red-eyed, reeking of liquor and trouble. One wore a Lakers jacket, zipped halfway to his throat. The other's boots tracked mud across the linoleum. Mia's eyes flicked up. Something about the way they moved set her nerves jangling, a cocky slouch, voices pitched just a bit too loud. The waitress, an older woman with tired eyes, tensed as she approached them. But the men brushed past her, zeroing in on Walter and his dog. "Hey, old man!" the first one barked, thumping his fist on the table so hard the mugs rattled. "What's with the mutt? You too scared to come out without your little guard dog?" Shadow's head lifted, eyes cold and unblinking. Walter said nothing. Mia saw his shoulders stiffen, his fingers tightening on his mug. The second man smirked, stumbling closer, invading Walter's space. "You deaf or just chicken?" he sneered, prodding at Walter's shoulder. "Bet that mutt's the only reason you come out at night." A chill snaked up Mia's spine. She saw the look in Walter's eyes, resentment, yes, but beneath it, a bone-deep weariness. The whole diner seemed to hold its breath. Rain pounded against the windows. Shadow's body went taut, muscles rippling beneath his coat as he shifted, placing himself squarely between Walter and the men. A low, rumbling growl vibrated from his chest, a sound that made the hairs on Mia's arms stand on end. "Back off," Walter finally said, his voice low and steady, but there was a tremor in it. He tried to shrink into the booth, but the men leaned in, the aggression sharp in the air. Mia's heart hammered. This wasn't her fight. She had seen enough violence for one night, had stitched up wounds caused by men just like these. Still, something in her wouldn't let her look away. She watched as Shadow's gaze tracked every movement, intelligent and fierce, like he was measuring the danger. The man in the Lakers jacket laughed, but it wasn't a nice sound. "You hear that, Jerry? Old man thinks he can tell us what to do. Maybe his mutt can teach him some manners." He reached out as if to shove Walter. That was the spark. Shadow snapped to his feet, bristling, his bark echoing through the diner. Plates rattled on the counter. The waitress gasped. The cook peeked through the kitchen window, and every eye in the place was locked on the confrontation. Time slowed. Mia could see the violence brewing in the men's eyes. Instinct roared to life inside her, something that had saved her more than once in the chaos of the ER. Before she knew it, she was on her feet, moving between the men and Walter, one hand outstretched, the other curled in a fist she didn't know she'd made. "That's enough," Mia said, her voice surprisingly steady. "You need to leave. Now." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Shadow stood pressed to her leg, body rigid. The taller man looked at Mia, his lip curling, then back at Walter. "You think we're scared of a nurse and a mutt?" He spat. She didn't flinch. Her eyes met his, unwavering. Rain slashed against the glass, thunder cracked above the roof, and something in Mia's posture made even the drunken bravado falter. The men exchanged glances. The one in the Lakers jacket hesitated, then spat on the floor. "We'll be seeing you," he snarled. "This ain't over." They shoved past, the bell clanging as they staggered into the storm, their laughter now edged with something dark. The diner slowly breathed again. Mia stood, muscles trembling as the adrenaline drained away. Shadow leaned against her, offering silent thanks. Walter's eyes met hers, grateful, haunted, a man too used to fighting alone. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, 3 unlikely defenders had drawn a line in the night. None of them knew what would come next, but Mia could feel it. The danger wasn't over. In the hush, her own heart pounded, warning her that the storm had only just begun. Rain lashed the city in relentless sheets, turning the sidewalks into rivers and alleys into dark, watery traps. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and wet asphalt. Most people were asleep, tucked safely in their homes, but not Mia, not Walter, and certainly not Shadow. The diner had closed early after the confrontation. The regulars scattered. Only the memory of tension lingered in the humid air. Walter insisted on walking Mia to her car, despite his stiff limp. Shadow trotted close to his side, pausing every few steps to look back at Mia, as if asking her to hurry. The storm felt heavier, more personal, like a warning. They turned down a narrow alley behind the diner, shortcutting to the lot where Walter's battered truck and Mia's old sedan waited. Trash cans overflowed, puddles gleamed like black mirrors, and a distant siren wailed somewhere in the city. Mia clutched her bag tighter, replaying the men's threat in her mind. "We'll be seeing you." The words gnawed at her. Suddenly, footsteps splashed behind them. Before anyone could react, the 2 men from the diner emerged from the shadows, no longer drunk and mocking, but hard-eyed and desperate. One of them carried a tire iron, the other gripped a switchblade. Walter stopped in his tracks. Shadow immediately sprang in front of him, teeth bared, every muscle ready. Mia's instincts screamed run, but her legs wouldn't move. She stared into the men's faces and saw something raw. Anger, shame, maybe even fear. "Well, what do you know?" The taller man sneered, his voice slurred but deadly. "Didn't think we'd let you walk away, did you?" Walter stepped forward, raising his hands. "You don't want to do this." "Shut up, old man!" The shorter man lunged. Shadow met him in a flash of teeth and snarls, knocking the man sideways. The switchblade flashed and caught Shadow across the flank. He yelped, a terrible sound that echoed off the wet brick. Mia's heart seized as she saw blood stain Shadow's fur. Rage surged through her. She dropped her bag, adrenaline burning away her fear. As the second man swung the tire iron at Walter, Mia threw herself between them, shoving Walter out of the way. The iron caught her shoulder, fire exploding down her arm. Before she could react, the man with the knife came at her. She twisted, taking the blow meant for Walter and Shadow. The blade sank into her side. Her breath caught, vision going white at the edges. Walter roared and grabbed the attacker's arm, wrestling him away. Shadow, despite his wound, lunged at the man with the iron, snapping and driving him back. Blood spattered across the alley. The men, panicked now, kept swinging. One caught Walter with the tire iron, sending him to his knees. Mia staggered, one hand pressed to her bleeding side. She forced herself to stand, to face them. "You want to hurt someone?" She spat. "You'll have to go through all of us." The attackers paused, thrown off by her defiance. For a moment, Mia saw confusion flicker in their eyes. Had they thought this would be easy? Had they expected the dog, the old man, the nurse, to simply crumble? Blue and red lights flickered at the alley's mouth. Someone must have called the police. Sirens wailed louder, closer. The attackers panicked. The taller one grabbed his friend, cursing, and they staggered into the rain, vanishing into the night. Silence fell, broken only by the drum of rain and the distant sirens. Mia collapsed to her knees, blood streaming down her scrubs. Walter crawled over to her, face white with shock. Shadow pressed himself against Mia, whining, licking her face. She could feel his warm breath, his pain. Mia blinked up at the storm, the city lights blurring through tears and rain. She was cold, so cold. Her hands shook as she pressed them to her wounds, trying to stem the flow. She looked at Walter, his face bloodied, eyes wild with fear, and then at Shadow, his own wound oozing crimson. All three of them, battered and broken, huddled together in the alley like survivors of a war. Police officers arrived, weapons drawn, voices sharp and urgent. Paramedics sprinted into the alley, kneeling beside Mia. She felt gloved hands pressed to her side, heard someone shout about blood loss. The world spun, fading in and out. But as darkness threatened to pull her under, Mia's gaze locked on Shadow's eyes. They were wide and full of pain, but also fierce, loyal, refusing to leave her. In that instant, she understood. They were both protectors, both willing to take the blows for someone they cared about. She reached out with trembling fingers, found Shadow's thick fur, and squeezed. He licked her hand, whining softly. Walter wept, silent tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "It's okay, girl," Mia whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was comforting Shadow or herself. "You're safe, I promise." Her words drifted away as the world slipped sideways. Blue lights danced across the rain-slicked bricks, voices blurred. Pain ebbed, replaced by numbness. Mia's last sensation before darkness claimed her was the warmth of Shadow's head against her palm and the knowledge that in this moment, neither of them had failed. Two wounded defenders holding the line together, even as the night closed in around them. The hospital lights were harsh, unforgiving and too bright, reflecting off white tile floors and polished metal rails. Everything seemed cold, clinical, and humming with that late-night, half-empty energy where time stretched and bent. When the ambulance burst through the ER bay, its siren fading to a desperate whine, the trauma team inside went from weary routine to focused, urgent motion. Mia Carter, once the nurse running codes, was now the patient. Blood soaked her scrubs, her skin clammy and pale, her breathing shallow. A paramedic called out her vitals, blood pressure dropping, pulse weak. In a dizzy haze, Mia drifted between consciousness and something darker. Her body shuddering from shock and blood loss. She caught glimpses, her hospital badge clipped upside down on her collar, the blur of familiar faces, someone calling, "She's one of ours!" An IV snapped into her arm, hands pressed to her wounds. The smell of antiseptic hit her nose. She wanted to speak, to tell them about Walter and Shadow, but her lips barely moved. "Hang in there, Mia. We've got you," a nurse whispered, her voice shaking as she stroked Mia's hair back from her sweat-soaked forehead. The world faded. On the other side of the hospital's swinging double doors, Walter sat hunched on a hard plastic chair, his hands stained with Mia's blood. His eyes darted between the surgery sign above the doors and the German shepherd pressed tight to his legs. Shadow's fur was streaked with his own blood, a thin white bandage taped hastily over the wound on his flank. He whimpered, head pressed to Walter's knee, refusing food, water, or even a moment's rest. Walter felt helpless. No gun, no orders, no enemy he could fight. Just the endless, crushing guilt that he hadn't been enough. Mia's face flickered in his mind, her words echoing. "You want to hurt someone? You'll have to go through all of us." He'd let her take the blow. He should have protected her. He clenched his jaw, eyes burning with unshed tears. He'd seen combat, had watched friends fall, but nothing prepared him for this. Watching a young woman bleed because he'd brought trouble with him. If Shadow hadn't been there, if Mia hadn't stepped in. No, he wouldn't let himself finish the thought. People came and went, whispering, glancing at the old veteran and his dog. A doctor passed, pausing to kneel beside Shadow, murmuring soft words and offering water. Shadow only turned his head, eyes locked on the doors, waiting for the woman who'd bled for him. Inside the operating room, time twisted around itself. Mia hovered on the edge, her body battered, her mind wandering through fragments and memories. She saw her father's face, smiling from behind a kitchen table cluttered with birthday candles and dog-eared storybooks. His voice, steady and warm, filled her with comfort. "You're stronger than you know, kiddo. Don't give up." She remembered her first dog, Lucky, the way he'd laid his head on her knee during thunderstorms, the way she'd whispered secrets into his fur. She remembered the feeling of helplessness, the long nights on call when someone's life hung in the balance and her hands felt clumsy and small. Those memories twisted through pain, carrying her between past and present. She drifted, half awake, half lost, hearing snatches of voices. "We're losing her. Pressure's dropping. Clamp that artery. Hang on, Mia, hang on!" Through it all, she felt Shadow's presence, like a warm, steady heartbeat anchoring her to the world. Hours crawled by, the waiting room filled with a handful of colleagues, faces grim and anxious. A nurse brought Walter a blanket, which he barely noticed, and someone else brought coffee that went cold on the floor beside his boots. Shadow never moved from his post. At last, the doors swung open. A surgeon appeared, mask pulled down, exhaustion etched into his face. He knelt in front of Walter. "She made it through surgery," he said quietly. "It was close, too close. But she's stable. We're taking her to the ICU now." Walter nodded, swallowing hard. "Can I see her?" The doctor shook his head. "Not yet. She needs time. But your dog, he won't leave the door. I've never seen anything like it." Walter managed a broken smile, looking down at Shadow. "He's stubborn," he whispered. "Always has been." The story spread quickly. By sunrise, the ICU was flooded with flowers, cards, and messages. Staff who'd never met Mia before came to sit with her for a few minutes, drawn by what she'd done. On social media, the hospital's story was trending. Nurse Shields' veteran and his service dog in alley attack, both wounded. But inside those sterile halls, the reality was simple. Mia lay unconscious, stitched and pale, her breath barely stirring the sheets. Walter kept vigil in silence. Shadow pressed tight to his feet, flinching at every beep of the monitors. Nurses and doctors who saw Shadow at the door found themselves blinking back tears. Late in the night, Walter leaned forward, his hand gently stroking Shadow's fur. "It's not your fault, boy," he murmured, voice cracking. "You did everything you could. We all did." Shadow whined, licking Walter's hand. Mia's dreams were fractured and feverish. She saw Lucky again, running through a field. She saw her father, arms open, calling her home. And then, through the haze, she felt something warm and real, a weight beside her on the hospital bed, a gentle breath against her hand. Somehow she knew. Shadow was waiting. And so was Walter. As dawn crept through the blinds, the hospital held its breath. Inside one small ICU room, 3 defenders, 1 nurse, 1 soldier, 1 wounded dog, held the line, together, against the night. Dawn broke with little ceremony, dragging pale light through the rain-streaked windows of St. Mary's Hospital. Outside, the sky was still a bruised, uncertain gray, but word of what had happened in the night had already traveled far beyond the sterile corridors. It began in whispers, nurses talking in the break room, paramedics texting fellow first responders, someone in the ER calling a friend at the local VA. By 7 a.m., the story was more than just rumor. A nurse had risked her life for a wounded veteran and his dog. She'd stood between violence and innocence, and now she lay fighting for her life in the ICU. Walter sat slumped by the window of Mia's room, staring blankly at the clouds beyond the glass. His clothes still smelled of rain and alley mud. The bruises on his face had blossomed into deep purple shadows. He looked older than his years, more fragile somehow, despite the way his hands clenched and unclenched, as if still gripping some invisible threat. Shadow was curled on a thin blanket beside the hospital bed, his nose inches from Mia's limp hand. The bandage on his flank was fresh, but he ignored his own pain, only lifting his head to whimper softly each time Mia's heart monitor beeped a little too fast or too slow. Nurses and aides tiptoed in and out, sometimes pausing to stroke Shadow's head or offer Walter a gentle word, but mostly giving them space. It was quiet inside, but outside, a different kind of vigil was forming. It started with a handful of veterans, some in battered ball caps, some with service medals pinned to their jackets, arriving one by one in the drizzle. Then came a group of off-duty firefighters, still in their navy t-shirts, boots splattered with mud. Paramedics showed up, sharing umbrellas with strangers. Therapy dog handlers arrived, leashes in hand, dogs with every size and color tail wagging at their sides. They didn't need signs or speeches, just presence, just silence, just rain. By mid-morning, a crowd had formed along the edge of the parking lot. Some stood with heads bowed. Others formed small knots, trading quiet stories about the night before. There were wheelchairs and walkers, old friends and people who had never met, all drawn together by the echo of a single brave act. Inside, Walter watched as the crowd grew. He couldn't understand it at first. He'd spent so much of his life feeling invisible, just another face in a sea of old soldiers, just another man trying to outrun ghosts. Now, looking through the blinds, he saw people standing in the rain, waiting for news, and realized they weren't just here for Mia. They were here for all of them. A young therapist, barely older than Mia, stopped by the room. "Would you like some coffee, sir?" she asked Walter gently. He shook his head, voice hoarse. "Not unless you got something for guilt." She smiled, kneeling down so she was eye level with Shadow. "Sometimes being here is enough. Shadow knows that, don't you, buddy?" She scratched behind Shadow's ear, earning a brief, thumping tail wag. Walter swallowed, his eyes suddenly burning. He pressed his palm to his forehead, trying to blink away tears. "She did this for us. I should have—" The therapist squeezed his shoulder. "She did what she thought was right. That's all any of us can do." She left a styrofoam cup on the windowsill before slipping out. Mia's hospital family took their own kind of vigil. Nurses rotated on and off shift, but someone always sat with her. Her supervisor read cards left by well-wishers. An orderly brought in a cluster of daffodils, bright against the clinical white. Even the chief of surgery stopped by, his face tight with worry. Walter found himself surrounded by more company than he'd had in years. Veterans drifted into the waiting room, nodding to him, offering stories or simple, wordless camaraderie. One old Marine gave Shadow a piece of jerky, and the dog, at last, ate. As the morning wore on, the rain thinned to a mist. The crowd outside didn't budge. Hospital staff took turns bringing out coffee and blankets, umbrellas passing from hand to hand. Therapy dogs made their rounds, pressing close to people shivering under thin jackets. Through it all, the news cameras stayed at a distance, respectful but ever present, capturing the unity that had sprung from one act of courage. On social media, strangers sent messages of support. Donations trickled in for Mia's recovery, for Walter's bills, for therapy dog programs. Inside, Walter's defenses finally broke. He leaned forward in his chair, face in his hands, silent sobs racking his battered frame. Shadow, sensing his pain, nudged his nose under Walter's arm, forcing his head onto Walter's lap. The old veteran clung to the dog, whispering broken thanks. It was in this moment, amid the flowers, the tears, the quiet, Walter understood the full weight of what Mia had done. She hadn't just saved him and Shadow. She'd sparked something bigger, a ripple moving out through the community, binding strangers together with threads of empathy and gratitude. As night fell, the crowd outside still held their post, a living testament to what bravery could inspire. Inside, Mia's family, by blood and by bond, kept watch over her, unwilling to let the light fade. In that hospital room, under the soft glow of monitors, Walter and Shadow found comfort in the nearness of others. The world outside was still broken, still bruised, but for the first time in a long while, Walter felt a kind of peace. They were not alone. None of them were. And as he drifted into exhausted sleep, the image of Mia's courage burned quietly in his heart, a beacon against the darkness, calling them all to stand together, whatever the dawn might bring. The world returned to Mia Carter in scattered flashes. beeping, hushed voices, the sharp tang of antiseptic, fragments she tried to piece together, like waking from a storm that left everything changed. She hovered for hours, or maybe days, in a fog of half-memories and broken dreams. The pain was there, dull and distant at first, then blooming, fierce, and insistent. But there was warmth, too. Something heavy and comforting weighed across her legs, a soft pressure she clung to when everything else felt uncertain. She fought her way back, breath by ragged breath, each inhale pulling her a little closer to the present. Eventually, the world sharpened. Light filtered through the window in soft stripes. A familiar voice, Walter's, rough and shaky, murmured nearby. Another sound, gentler, the faint whine and sigh of a dog resting his head on the mattress. Mia opened her eyes. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling tiles above her were unfamiliar. She tried to move and pain shot through her side, a reminder of all that had happened. The alley, the attack, the cold, wet pavement, the desperate faces, Shadow's cry. She gasped, eyes wide, hand automatically searching for the wound. Her fingers found a thick bandage beneath her hospital gown. The heart monitor quickened, drawing Walter's attention. He sat up from his spot by the window, his face breaking into a mixture of relief and regret. Shadow lifted his head, ears perked, amber eyes locked onto Mia as if she alone mattered in the world. Walter shuffled over, gripping the edge of her bed with trembling hands. "Hey, Mia. You're awake. Thank God. We didn't know when you'd come back." Mia blinked, trying to focus. Her lips were dry. She could barely speak. "Shadow?" Her voice was little more than a whisper. Shadow responded instantly, pulling himself up and planting his front paws on the mattress, careful not to jostle her. He sniffed her hand and then, with a deep, chesty sigh, lay his head gently beside her. Mia smiled, a weak, exhausted curve, but genuine. She reached out, fingers trembling, and touched his fur. It was the first thing that felt real since the alley. Walter hovered, tears glistening in his eyes. "He hasn't left your side. None of us have. The whole hospital's been rooting for you." His voice cracked, the hard veteran exterior peeling away to show a raw, overwhelming gratitude. A nurse slipped in, eyes brightening at the sight of Mia awake. She hurried to the monitors, checking readings, then called out into the hall. Within minutes, the room filled with the people who'd kept vigil, colleagues, friends, even strangers drawn in by the story of her bravery. Someone squeezed her hand, another brushed her hair from her face. Mia tried to process the faces and names, each one etched with relief. Outside the window, Mia saw something she didn't understand at first. A crowd stretching all the way to the street, umbrellas forming a patchwork of color. Uniformed veterans, nurses in scrubs, firefighters, therapy dogs, signs with her name, words like hero, thank you, community. News cameras stood at a respectful distance. Even through the glass, she could feel the hum of hope and support. Walter followed her gaze, his voice thick. "They're here for you, for all of us. You did something. You reminded everyone what matters." Mia's mind spun. She'd just done what she hoped anyone would. She'd stepped in. She'd tried to help. The consequences had nearly cost her everything. And yet, looking at Shadow, feeling his unwavering presence, she understood. Sometimes the bravest acts weren't the loudest. Sometimes they were the ones that left scars. The hospital PR team entered, gently updating her on the outpouring of support. Donations had started pouring in for her medical expenses, for Walter and Shadow's care, and even for therapy dog programs across the city. Letters and cards arrived by the hundreds, messages from strangers touched by her courage. Local news had picked up the story. By morning, national outlets were calling. Mia's phone buzzed with requests she was too tired to answer, but the hospital promised to shield her as much as possible. Reporters lingered in the lobby, hoping for a quote or a photo. Hospital security doubled shifts to keep the crowds respectful. Volunteers organized food drives and blood donations in Mia's honor. She felt both grateful and overwhelmed, the sheer scale of the response nearly as hard to process as the pain. Through it all, Shadow stayed with her. Nurses brought him water and bits of cooked chicken. Children from the pediatric ward visited, shyly handing Mia handmade cards. A little boy, clutching a toy dog, peered up at Shadow and whispered, "Is he a real hero too?" Mia, voice still thin, replied, "He's the bravest I know." Walter remained close, helping manage the flow of well-wishers and media, his own wounds slowly healing. At one point, he knelt beside Mia's bed, taking her hand in both of his. "You saved us, Mia. You saved me, and you saved Shadow. I don't have the words, but I'm not going to waste this second chance." The day passed in a blur. Visitors cycled through. Hospital staff took photos for the growing wall of support. By evening, Mia found herself alone with Shadow and Walter, the room finally quiet. The world beyond her window was changed, no longer indifferent, but alive with a sense of shared purpose. For the first time, she let herself feel it. Her actions mattered. She was part of something larger, a current of kindness and courage rippling out from that rain-soaked alley. As night fell and Shadow curled against her, Mia whispered, "Thank you, boy." Her hand shook as she stroked his fur, but her voice was steady. "We're in this together." And for the first time since the violence, she didn't feel alone. It didn't take long for the news to spark a citywide storm. The morning after Mia's awakening, talk radio stations buzzed with debate, social media churned with hashtags, and news vans circled the hospital like hungry birds. The story had everything: violence, heroism, sacrifice, and a loyal dog standing guard over the woman who had shielded him. But as the facts spread, so did something darker: controversy. It started with a blog post from a witness who hadn't seen the whole confrontation. "Dog causes chaos in alley attack," the headline read, twisting the story. The attackers' families, desperate to protect their own, spoke to the media, claiming Shadow had lunged first, escalating what should have been just an argument. Footage of Shadow barking in the diner played on the news, stripped of context. Online comments grew ugly. "He's an attack dog, not a hero. Why are we celebrating violence? Service dogs should be banned from public spaces." Veterans and nurses across the city were furious. Mia's friends rallied online and off, countering the narrative with the truth. Shadow only defended. He saved lives. Mia's supervisor gave a tearful interview. ER nurses posted photos with Shadow, captioned "Hero." Still, the debate raged. By midweek, the story had become a flashpoint for bigger issues: how cities treat veterans, how service animals are seen, how quick people are to judge. Mia watched it all from her hospital bed, her phone lighting up with support and hate in equal measure. She tried to focus on healing, but the conflict weighed on her. It came to a head at a city council meeting, hastily organized as public pressure grew. Protesters gathered outside City Hall, some with homemade signs: "Shadow saves lives," "Therapy dogs, child healing," others waving banners calling for stricter rules on animals in public. News cameras streamed live. The mayor, a shrewd woman with sharp eyes, saw an opportunity to bring the fractured city together, or risk letting it tear itself apart. Walter insisted on going. He wore his best shirt and polished his battered shoes. Shadow wore a bright red bandana that children at the hospital had decorated with paw prints and hearts. Mia, despite her doctor's concerns, demanded to attend too, arriving in a wheelchair pushed by a fellow nurse. She refused to be a silent symbol for someone else's cause. The meeting was electric. Veterans in uniform stood shoulder to shoulder with nurses in scrubs and parents with anxious children clinging to their hands. On the other side, angry voices called for justice for the men who'd been injured. Never mind that they'd started the fight. Reporters crowded every aisle, microphones thrust forward, waiting for a misstep or a headline. Mia waited her turn, nerves jangling. Her side still hurt, and Shadow leaned against her leg, sensing her tension. Walter put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You got this, kid," he whispered. "They need to hear the truth." When she spoke, the room fell silent. She told the story simply, leaving out nothing: the rain, the threats, the attack, Shadow's bravery, and her own choice to step between violence and the innocent. She spoke not just as a nurse, but as someone who'd seen what courage and loyalty could do. "I didn't act alone," she finished, voice strong. "I was part of a team. Me, Walter, and Shadow. We stood together. And I know how many people out there need what therapy dogs like Shadow can give." There was applause, murmurs of agreement. The mayor leaned forward, her gaze thoughtful. "Ms. Carter, would you accept a leadership role if the city launched a therapy dog initiative? Something to honor what you and Shadow have shown us?" Mia was stunned. The words rippled through the room, cutting through the noise and anger. She nodded, emotion clogging her throat. "Yes, ma'am. I'd be honored. So would Shadow." That moment broke the tension. Veterans began sharing stories: how service dogs kept them steady, how therapy dogs soothed children's nightmares. Nurses spoke about the healing they'd witnessed. The council voted, nearly unanimously, to launch a citywide therapy dog program, naming Mia as its first director. As the meeting ended, reporters crowded around, but Mia held up her hand. "This isn't about just one night or one hospital. It's about every person in this city who needs help and hope. And it's about heroes, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. Shadow barked, tail wagging, as if he understood. That night, news anchors announced the new initiative. Social media lit up with support. The city felt different: hopeful, united, energized. Strangers high-fived in the street. Donations for the therapy dog program skyrocketed. Parents brought their children to meet Shadow outside the hospital. People who'd never cared about veterans or therapy animals before now asked how they could help. Mia and Walter stood together on the steps of City Hall as the crowd parted for them. Shadow trotted between them, head held high, the red bandana glowing against his dark fur. For the first time since that violent night, Mia felt a sense of peace, mingled with resolve. They had weathered the storm, not just the rain, but the firestorm of public judgment, and emerged with something powerful: a chance to change lives. As the city celebrated, Mia looked down at Shadow and smiled. "We did it, boy. This is just the beginning." And as the sun broke through the clouds, shining on a city transformed, it felt, for once, like a new day had truly begun. Courtrooms have their own kind of weather, a heavy hush that settles over wood and stone, punctuated only by the click of shoes or the nervous cough of a spectator. When Mia entered, supported by Walter on one side and flanked by a determined Shadow on the other, every eye in the room seemed to follow them. She wore her scars openly, bandages still peeking from beneath her blouse, a healing wound dark against her skin, a determined light in her gaze that spoke of battles fought and survived. The city had gathered here, in this old marble chamber, to watch the next chapter unfold. Mia had become a symbol, a lightning rod for the divided opinions swirling through Los Angeles. The attackers, seated at the defense table with fresh suits and nervous glances, had hired a sharp attorney, eager to spin the story in their favor. They claimed Shadow had incited the violence, that Mia and Walter had escalated a minor confrontation into bloodshed. Reporters filled the back rows, pens poised. TV cameras waited for a soundbite that would define the day. As proceedings began, the prosecution painted a picture of courage and self-sacrifice, of a nurse who, without thought for her own safety, protected a veteran and his service dog. They called witnesses, the diner's waitress, who described the men's belligerence, an off-duty EMT who'd arrived in the aftermath, even the ER doctor who'd operated on Mia. Each voice reinforced the reality of that night. The rain, the threats, the violence, and the unwavering bond between human and dog. The defense pressed hard. They showed a grainy clip from the diner's security camera, Shadow barking, moving between Walter and the men. Aggressive, the attorney insisted. Provoked. He hammered at the notion that Walter and Shadow were somehow responsible for what followed. The attackers themselves testified, their voices trembling, painting themselves as victims. Mia's turn to testify arrived. The bailiff helped her to the stand, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to lean forward. She spoke with clarity, her voice steady even when her hands trembled. She recounted every detail, the fear, the men's threats, Shadow's defensive posture, and the split-second decision to shield Walter. Shadow didn't attack anyone, she said. He protected. If not for him, I wouldn't be alive. The cross-examination was brutal. The defense attorney tried to twist her words, to paint her as reckless or confused. Mia refused to waver. I work in an ER, she said, locking eyes with the jury. I know what real danger looks like. Those men weren't scared. They were looking for someone to hurt. Shadow did what he was trained to do. He stood his ground and protected the innocent. For a tense hour, it seemed the outcome hung in the balance. The jury listened, but doubt flickered across faces. Outside, crowds gathered, holding up signs. Justice for Mia. Shadow is a hero. Support our nurses and vets. The mayor attended, sitting quietly in the gallery. Walter paced the hallway, fists clenched. Shadow, sensing the tension, pressed close to Mia's feet, unmoving. Then came the dramatic twist. The prosecutor announced a new piece of evidence, a security tape from an alley business adjacent to the diner, previously overlooked. The courtroom held its breath as the footage played. It was grainy, rain-blurred, but unmistakable. The attackers cornering Mia, Walter, and Shadow. The men brandishing weapons. Shadow standing between his people and the threat. Never lunging, only holding his ground. The violence that followed was clear. One-sided, desperate, a last stand in the rain. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor spoke quietly. Ladies and gentlemen, what you see is not a threat. It's loyalty and courage under fire. The judge instructed the jury. Deliberations lasted less than an hour. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts for the attackers, the room erupted in applause and tears. Reporters rushed to the front. The mayor stood, applauding. Veterans and nurses hugged each other in relief. Walter, silent and shaking, held Shadow's face in his hands, whispering, "We did it, boy. You did it." Outside, a sea of supporters awaited. As Mia, Walter, and Shadow exited the courthouse, applause broke out. Cameras flashed, children waved handmade signs. The city's pain and division melted, at least for a moment, into something like unity. That evening, at a hastily arranged ceremony on the courthouse steps, the mayor presented Mia, Walter, and Shadow with medals for bravery. Mia accepted with humility, her speech short but powerful. "No one fights alone. This city stood with us, and together we turned darkness into hope. Let's keep building that together." Walter's burden seemed lighter as he stood beside Mia, sharing the moment. Shadow, for once, seemed content to bask in the attention, his wounds healing, his heart at peace. The city honored them, not just as victims or survivors, but as guardians, proof that sometimes doing the right thing does change the world. In the aftermath, as dusk fell and lights twinkled across Los Angeles, Mia looked up at the sky, hand resting on Shadow's head. "This isn't just our victory," she murmured. "It belongs to everyone who ever needed someone to stand up for them." For the first time since the stormy night at the diner, she allowed herself to believe in something simple and powerful. Justice was possible, and so was healing, even after the darkest of nights. Mia Carter never imagined that her world would expand from a single hospital ER to an entire city hungry for hope. The days after the trial felt like a sunrise after a long storm, casting gold and warmth where there had only been shadow. She was no longer just a nurse. She was a symbol, her scars reminders not only of pain, but of courage that refused to fade. Shadow's bandages came off before hers did, and with each careful step, he grew more like his old self, tail wagging, eyes bright, always ready to work. Together, Mia and Shadow became the faces of the city's new therapy dog initiative. Walter, once content to blend into the background, stood at her side, his story an anchor for others adrift in their own struggles. The program launched with more attention than anyone had predicted. The city council funded a dedicated team. Hospitals, schools, and veterans centers clamored to be included. News cameras documented the kickoff. Mia in her crisp blue blazer, Shadow in his red bandana, Walter in his old marine jacket with a row of service pins shining above his heart. The first day, Mia led Shadow into the children's wing of St. Mary's Hospital. The ward was bright, decorated with drawings and balloons, but everyone inside moved carefully, carrying the invisible weight of illness. Mia felt a lump in her throat as they approached a boy named Lucas, pale and thin, curled around a stuffed bear. Shadow approached with gentle steps. Mia knelt beside Lucas, introducing them both. "This is Shadow. He's been through some tough times, just like you." Lucas reached out, trembling, and Shadow laid his head in the boy's lap. The room fell silent except for the soft sound of fur against sheets. Lucas began to talk, first to Shadow, then to Mia, and then to his parents, who cried tears of joy at the first words he'd spoken in days. Word spread. Every day, Mia and Shadow visited new places, trauma wards, shelters, classrooms. They met veterans scarred inside and out. One man, hands shaking, confessed that he hadn't slept through the night in years. Shadow curled beside him, breathing slow and deep, and the veteran's tremors eased. "It's like he knows," the man whispered, and Mia nodded. "He does. You're not alone." Walter became a fixture at the therapy dog center, leading group sessions with other veterans. He told his story with candor, never flinching from the darkness, but always shining a light on what had brought him back. People who had spent years in silence found comfort in his honesty. "Shadow saved me," Walter would say, "but so did every person who reached out when I needed it." The initiative became more than a program. It became a movement. Mia organized workshops for new handlers, teaching them how to connect with patients and each other. She partnered with local colleges to expand training for therapy animals. Invitations poured in from other cities, other states, even overseas, asking her to speak about the bond that had changed her life and so many others. Still, she never lost sight of the people right in front of her. One afternoon, Mia found herself sitting with a teenage girl named Jasmine, who refused to speak to anyone after a traumatic event. Jasmine flinched at every sound, her arms wrapped tight around her knees. Shadow approached, then paused, lying down a few feet away. He waited, patient and quiet, until Jasmine finally looked up and whispered, "He's not leaving, is he?" Mia smiled softly. "No. He'll wait as long as you need." For an hour, the three of them sat together. Jasmine began to talk, haltingly at first, then in a rush, words tumbling out after weeks of silence. Mia listened, and Shadow listened, and the healing began. There were days when the pain of her wounds returned, when Mia doubted herself, when the world's needs felt like more than she could carry. On those days, she remembered the alley, the rain, the fear that almost swallowed her. She looked at Shadow, at Walter, at the hundreds of lives touched by a single act of courage, and she found her strength again. The city recognized her efforts with a public celebration in the park. Families gathered, children played with therapy dogs, and veterans shared stories around picnic tables. The mayor handed Mia a plaque, but what mattered more were the quiet thank yous from people whose lives had been transformed. As the sun dipped low, Mia stood on stage, Shadow at her feet and Walter beside her. She scanned the crowd and saw faces she'd once only known as patients or headlines. Now they were friends, part of a growing circle of compassion. "We started this because of one terrible night," Mia said into the microphone, her voice steady. "But every day since has reminded me that healing isn't just about medicine. It's about connection, about showing up, even when you're scared. It's about letting others stand with you." She looked down at Shadow. "If a dog can change a city, imagine what we can do together." After the ceremony, a boy approached her, a teenager with scars on his arms and questions in his eyes. "Does it get easier?" he asked quietly. Mia knelt to meet him eye to eye. "Some days are hard, but you don't have to face them alone." Shadow nosed the boy's hand, and for the first time the boy smiled. As dusk settled and lanterns flickered to life, Mia realized the movement she'd helped spark was just beginning. Every life touched, every heart opened, was a step toward a city less divided by fear and more united by hope. She hugged Walter, ruffled Shadow's fur, and promised herself, no matter how dark the night, she would keep building something new, one act of courage at a time. As the seasons turned and summer melted into fall, life in Los Angeles found its rhythm again. The story of the alley, the nurse, the veteran, the dog, had moved from breaking news to quiet legend, something spoken of in classrooms, whispered by parents at bedtime, written about in essays and local news retrospectives. But for those at the heart of it, the days weren't marked by headlines, but by the small daily acts of living. Mia's scars faded slowly, pale reminders along her side and shoulder. Sometimes when she looked in the mirror, she'd run her fingers along the lines and remember the sting, the fear, the rain. But more often, she remembered what came after. The warmth of hands holding hers, Shadow's soft fur pressed close, the voices of people she hadn't known before, who now filled her life with meaning. The Therapy Dog initiative grew beyond anything she could have dreamed. New volunteers came every week, drawn by stories of hope and transformation. She trained each one herself, teaching them not just how to handle the dogs, but how to listen, really listen, to those who needed them. She spoke at events and workshops, always emphasizing that healing wasn't a single moment, but a process, a slow and sometimes painful rebuilding. One day, as golden light spilled across the therapy center's main room, Walter arrived for his usual Wednesday shift. His gait was steadier, his laughter easier. The lines on his face seemed softer, deepened more by smiles than by pain. Shadow was always at his side, eager to greet children and veterans alike, somehow sensing exactly what each person needed: a gentle nuzzle, a playful bark, or just the reassurance of his silent company. Mia and Walter often lingered after closing, talking about everything and nothing. One evening, as dusk crept in, they sat on the center's back steps, Shadow curled at their feet. The city buzzed beyond the fence, but here, time slowed. "You know," Walter said, voice thoughtful, "there was a time I thought I was done, that maybe I'd had my shot at meaning, and everything else was just waiting for the end." Mia nudged his arm, her smile gentle. "You're not the only one. I think most people feel that way, at least once." Walter stared at the horizon. "Shadow saved me from my darkest nights, but it wasn't just him. It was you, this place, all these people." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Funny how life circles around, how the people you save end up saving you right back." Mia looked down at her hands. She thought about the people who'd crossed her path. Lucas, the quiet boy in the hospital. Jasmine, the teenager learning to trust again. The veteran who'd wept in Shadow's fur. Each one was a reminder that healing moved in both directions. "Courage isn't loud," Mia said quietly. "It's not just about running into danger. Sometimes it's just getting up, showing up, doing what you can even when you're tired or scared. Most of the time, no one sees. But it matters." They sat in silence, the weight of their shared history settling around them. The city was still bruised, still wrestling with old wounds and new fears. But here, in the quiet, something had shifted. The ripple from that single night, Mia's decision, Shadow's loyalty, Walter's resilience, had become a current, carrying others forward. As the sky deepened to indigo, a few therapy dog teams returned from evening visits. A young handler, her dog trotting happily at her side, waved as she passed. "Another good day?" Walter called, and the handler beamed. "Best one yet." Mia watched them go, pride swelling in her chest. The impact of their work wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was just a smile, a softening in someone's eyes, the first laugh in weeks. But it all mattered. Late that night, as she closed up the center, Mia paused at the wall where photos of the program's graduates hung. There were dozens now. Patients, kids, veterans, even hospital staff. Each one had a caption, a favorite memory, a thank you, a lesson learned. She added a new photo, Shadow with Lucas, the boy's smile wide and easy. She pinned it to the board and stood back, letting herself feel the full weight of what they'd built. Healing, she realized, often began with connection. Not medicine alone, but simple presence. The willingness to stand by someone, to see them, to believe they were worth saving. As she locked up, Walter caught up with her in the parking lot, shadow padding between them. "What now?" he asked, not as a challenge but with genuine curiosity. "We keep going," Mia answered. "One day at a time, one person at a time." Walter nodded, understanding. "You know, in all my years, I never really believed in second chances. But this feels like one." Shadow let out a soft, contented bark, as if to agree. That night, Mia wrote in her journal, a habit she'd picked up during recovery. Her words flowed, honest and unfiltered. "Courage is the quiet decision to act, even when no one is watching. Loyalty is found in every act of showing up for someone else, human or animal. Healing doesn't always come from medicine or therapy. Sometimes it starts with a single act of kindness." As she finished, she smiled, tears stinging her eyes, not from pain, but from gratitude. The lessons of the alley, of the hospital, of the new family she'd found, ran deep. The bonds built in adversity, she realized, became the bridges that carried entire communities through their darkest hours and into the light. 1 year later, Los Angeles glowed beneath a bright, cloudless sky. The city had changed in 100 small ways, some visible, some known only to those whose lives had been quietly transformed. On a sunny afternoon in spring, a crowd gathered at the heart of Griffith Park for the first annual Guardians Parade, a celebration of service dogs, therapy teams, and the community that had grown from one fateful night. Colorful banners rippled in the breeze. Families set out picnic blankets. Veterans, children, nurses, and city officials mingled on the grass. Booths lined the main walk, staffed by therapy dog trainers, volunteers, and those who had once been recipients of their kindness. Even the mayor, usually buttoned up and guarded, was caught laughing as a golden retriever gently tugged at her shoelace. But the center of attention, as always, was Shadow. He led the opening procession, his coat glossy in the sun, his head high. A new medal gleamed at his collar, and children jostled to pet him, their parents snapping photos. Shadow walked with the quiet pride of someone who'd seen darkness and chosen, again and again, to be the light. Mia Carter walked just behind him, her stride strong, her face open and unafraid. Her scars were still visible, pale reminders of a night that had changed her forever, but she wore them like badges of honor. Walter, a few steps behind, wore a sharp navy suit adorned with his Marine Corps pin and a proud, contented smile. It was a day of celebration, but for the three of them, it was also a day of remembrance. The parade wound through the park, ending at an outdoor auditorium packed with hundreds of supporters. As the crowd settled, Mia took the stage, pausing for a moment at the podium as the afternoon sunlight caught the gold in her hair. She scanned the audience, so many familiar faces and so many new ones. Lucas waved shyly from the front row. Jasmine clapped beside her mother, and a whole row of veterans stood in the back, their faces alight with hope. Therapy dogs lounged at their handlers' feet, some wearing bandanas, others vests or simple tags. The air thrummed with excitement, but as Mia raised her hand, the noise faded into an expectant hush. She began, her voice steady but warm. "A year ago, I was just a nurse trying to do her job. I never imagined that a single night, a single choice could lead to all this. I never imagined that stepping in to help someone would connect me to a whole city, to people I never would have met otherwise." She looked down, letting her hand rest on Shadow's head. "I was scared that night, terrified, but I wasn't alone. Walter, Shadow, and I, we stood together because that's what you do for your family. And that's what all of you have shown me this past year. That family is not just blood, but the people who stand by you when you need it most. Mia's gaze swept the crowd. We launched the Therapy Dog Initiative to bring comfort to those who needed it. Patients in hospitals, veterans struggling with memories, kids who just needed a friend. We wanted to prove that one act of courage could start a wave of healing. And looking out at all of you, I know we did. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Mia raised her hand for quiet, her eyes shining. I've learned a lot in the past year. I've learned that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just showing up when it would be easier to stay home. Sometimes it's reaching out, even when you're hurting. Sometimes it's letting someone else carry you when you can't walk another step. She paused, letting her words settle over the crowd. Shadow taught me that. Walter taught me that. And now, you've all taught me that too. Walter joined her at the podium, his hand steady on her shoulder. I spent a long time believing I had to face my battles alone, he said, his voice rumbling with emotion. But you all proved me wrong. This city, this family. He gestured to the gathered crowd. You're the reason I found my way back. The mayor stepped up, presenting Shadow with a special commendation. As the crowd cheered, the mayor spoke. Shadow reminds us all what loyalty and courage look like. Mia reminds us that anyone, at any time, can choose to be a guardian. And Walter reminds us that even after the darkest night, healing is possible. The celebration continued with laughter, music, and stories. But the day wasn't just about joy. It was also about reflection. Mia made her way through the crowd, talking to those whose lives had been touched by the program. One young woman clutched her hand, whispering, "You gave me hope when I thought I had none." A Vietnam veteran hugged Shadow and wept, unable to find words. As the sun set, Mia returned to the stage one last time. She called for quiet, her voice firm. If there's one thing I want everyone here to remember, it's this. The most important acts of courage are often unplanned, born of instinct and compassion. You never know whose life you might change just by showing up. You never know when you'll be called to be someone's guardian in their darkest hour. She took a breath, her heart full. If this story moved you, join us. Stand up for the vulnerable. Be the light for someone else's night. Walter, Shadow, and the therapy dog teams joined her, forming a line at the front of the stage. The crowd stood as one, some wiping away tears, others raising their hands in quiet salute. That night, as lanterns floated over the park and the city shimmered with possibility, Mia knelt beside Shadow, surrounded by those they'd helped, her scars shining in the lantern light. She knew that the story would live on, not just in headlines or speeches, but in the kindness people chose every day when they decided to stand together. For that was the true legacy of the brave, the power to inspire, to heal, and to remind a city and a world that we are all guardians, capable of being the light in someone else's night.